It is the 17th of March 1401, a day that will live in infamy in Syrian history. A massive army is arrayed before the great city of Damascus, which has been under siege for several months. Despite promises by the commander of the enemy army that he will spare the city's inhabitants if they surrender, his forces lay waste to all before them, burning everything in sight, enslaving and killing tens of thousands, and even destroying the city's ancient Umayyad mosque. 20 years later, people can still see the devastation caused to Damascus, and yet this is just one of the many acts of devastation inflicted on peoples and cities from the Levant to India by the fearsome ruler of a vast new empire that dominates Asia. His name? Timur, founder of the Timurid Empire. The man known to history as Timur was the founder and first ruler of the Timurid Empire, and according to the chronicles of his life, written much later, was born on the 9th of April 1336 near a town which was then called Kesh in Central Asia, but which is now known as Shahrazabs in the south of Uzbekistan. Today, a gigantic statue around 10 meters high of Timur stands in the center of Shahrazabs in honor of the city's most famous son. Some historians doubt the accuracy of this birth date and believe it is more likely that Timur was born several years earlier, perhaps even as early as 1328 or 1329. There is a strong argument that the 1336 date is close to the truth though, as Timur lived down to 1405 and was still able to engage in military campaigns right up to his death. Had he been born in 1329 or so, he would have still been campaigning in his mid-70s, which seems implausibly old. Timur means iron. A later legend attached itself to him that when he was born, there was an unusual amount of blood on the palms of the baby's hands, a sign that he would be responsible for shedding much blood in his lifetime. His father was Tarakhay, a minor aristocratic lord of the Baras clan, a tribe of Tatar or Turkic-Mongol people in this part of Central Asia. Timur's mother is noted in the chronicles as being a woman called Tekina Khatun. Of her, virtually nothing is otherwise known. Indeed, as we will see shortly, Timur's youth and early life are shrouded in mystery. Timur's rise to power and the empire he would build was possible only because of immense changes which had occurred across Asia in the century and a half before he was born. For hundreds of years, going back to the 7th and 8th centuries, Turkish or Turkic groups like the Karluks, Kazakhs, Turkmen and Uzbeks had dominated much of Central Asia, the region between the Caspian Sea in the west and the Himalayas in the east. They had become the ruling powers here after migrating southwestwards from regions further to the north and east in Siberia and Mongolia. The Turks eventually adopted the Islamic faith of the Arabs, Persians and other groups like the Sogdians that they had encountered in Central Asia. Over time, they became more sedentary and less warlike. This also made them more vulnerable to attack from a subsequent wave of invaders from Mongolia. In the first years of the 13th century, a warlord there named Temujin, better known today as Genghis, united the Mongolian tribes under his leadership as Khan and began a series of relentless military campaigns that spread Mongol rule into Central Asia and beyond. The Barlas clan to which Timur belonged was one of the Mongolian clans which joined Genghis Khan's armies. Therefore, Timur's birth in the land of the Uzbeks in the middle of the 14th century was only possible because of the manner in which Genghis Khan united the Mongolian tribes and then waged war on the Turkic people of Central Asia, conquering them and establishing a wholly new Mongol ruling class in the region. Genghis's successors had continued to expand the empire he began building, and by the 1270s, Mongol rule extended from the edges of Poland in Europe to Korea in the Far East. The vast size of the Mongol Empire by then had made it unwieldy in an age when transmitting information and orders across such vast distances could take months or even years. As a result, the Mongol Empire began to splinter following the death of Mungke Khan in 1259. Eventually, 4 major Mongol states emerged. In the east, Kublai Khan would rule over Mongolia, China, and other lands like Korea. The Golden Horde was formed out of the lands in Eastern Europe, Russia, the Caucasus, and on the eastern side of the Caspian Sea in what is now Kazakhstan. Timur would one day clash with this state. More consequential in his early days were the Chagatai Khanate and the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate ruled over much of the northern half of the Middle East, the land of the Turkmen on the southeastern side of the Caspian Sea and what was then known as Persia, modern-day Iran. Timur was born within the lands of the Chagatai Khanate, which controlled lands around modern-day Uzbekistan, much of Afghanistan, and some adjoining lands east into part of western Mongolia. By the time Timur was born here, the situation had changed again. The Mongols, like the Turks before them hundreds of years earlier, had begun to intermarry with the Turkic peoples of Central Asia and adopt much of their culture. For instance, the Mongols were now living in cities and towns filled with Turkic architecture of a kind which was in turn indebted to Persian and Arab culture. Most importantly, the Mongols, who in Genghis's time had followed a religion which was animist and shamanist and prioritized the sky god Tengri, began to convert in large numbers to Islam in Central Asia. Therefore, while Timur was born into a Mongol tribe near Kesh and the Chagatai Khanate ruled the region, the reality was that the elite was now a hybrid Turkic-Mongol people that adhered to Islam and lived in cities and towns that owed quite a lot to the Turkic, Persian, and Arab culture. The empire Timur would build would reflect this complex and fluid political, cultural, and religious environment. There is very little known about Timur's early years, and what we apparently have information about, such as the date of his birth, is open to dispute, for the sources for Timur's life were all generally written well after the events they purport to describe, and they are in the form of chronicles and histories that are of dubious objectivity. There are no neutral administrative records that have survived to confirm the accuracy of the later accounts. Of these chronicles, the most valuable is the Zafarnama, meaning Book of Victories, written by the Persian scholar and historian Sharaf al-Din Ali Yazdi. It was written in the second half of the 1420s, between 20 and 25 years after Timur's death. Sharaf had grown up in the 1380s and 1390s himself, so he lived through many of the events he described, and also had access to documentation produced as part of Timurid rule, as well as being able to interview many figures who had known and served Timur. This being said, the Zafarnama was commissioned by a grandson of Timur's, and it was panegyric, meaning it was written in such a way as to lionize Timur's life and reign. As such, it cannot be read uncritically as an objective account of Timur and his actions. It is more than balanced out by the highly critical Ajaib al-Maqdur fi Nawaib al-Timur, written by Ibn Arab Shah. This transliterates as the wonders of destiny of the ravages of Timur. Arab Shah was a child when Timur's armies sacked the city of Damascus in Syria where he lived. He was carried off to Samarkand as a slave and spent 20 years there, resulting in his account of Timur's life and deeds being understandably quite hostile. There are several other chronicles of Timur's life. All have to be handled with caution to get to the truth of the ruler they purport to describe. The chronicles are very quiet on the subject of Timur's childhood. We can imagine what his life was like as a part of a quasi-nomadic Turkic-Mongol tribe on the Asian steppe, rearing livestock that were the basis of sustenance and trade. Education centered for a boy like Timur on learning to fight on horseback. What the later accounts do suggest is that there were signs from a young age that Timur was destined for greatness. His grandmother was a seer who one night had a vision in her sleep that Timur would, quote, be lord of the stars and master of the kings of the age. Beyond these grandiose statements, written with the benefit of hindsight in knowing that he conquered much of Asia, there are virtually no specifics on his early life. Instead, the first concrete details that we have come from 1360, when he was already in his mid-20s or older. Timur's emergence at this time was closely connected to the decline of the Chagatai Khanate. In 1347, the ruler of the Khanate, Amir Kazan, was killed by a rival, Amir Kazakhan. This marked a shift in the power dynamics within the Khanate. Amir Kazakhan was never able to establish complete control over the geographically disparate Chagatai lands, and by the 1350s, there were effectively several regional rulers after forming their own small dominions throughout the Khanate. In 1358, Amir Kazakhan was assassinated, further destabilizing what remained of the Khanate. It was in this environment of political and military fragmentation that Timur shows up for the first time. In 1360, he allied with Tughluq Timur, the Khan of the tribes of Mongolia, who was trying to use the crisis to reassert direct Mongolian control over this part of Central Asia, a region also known as Transoxiana, as it straddles the Oxus River. Timur swore fidelity to Tughluq and campaigned with him for a time. Then he abandoned the alliance and formed a partnership with Amir Hussein, the ruler of the town of Balkh in northern Afghanistan. This was sealed with a marriage to Hussein's sister, Aljai. Thereafter, Timur and Hussein formed what was little more than a small band of raiders attacking locations around southern Uzbekistan and northern Afghanistan throughout the early 1360s. Timur even spent 2 months detained in a rat-infested cowshed after he was captured by a Mongol raiding party. Worse still was to follow for Timur. In 1363, after being released from captivity, he received the injury which resulted in the nickname by which he was long known to the world. While serving in a military party near Khorasan, on the Iranian plateau, he was struck by several arrows. One hit him in the shoulder, another in the leg, and another in the right hand. The missile that hit his hand removed his 2 smaller fingers. The most consequential injury, though, was to his right leg. The wound was deep, and his walk was permanently impaired thereafter. Even in his own time, Timur had become known as Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane. Apparently, Timur crawled to safety after the attack, and was saved by some local shepherds. It was a formative moment, both because of the injury he suffered, and because thereafter his ascent as a major warlord began, almost as though the attack and the damage it inflicted on him made him even more determined to establish a power base for himself in Transoxiana. Over the next 3 years, he and Hussein grew their strength and formed alliances with new groups across Transoxiana. Then, in 1366, they descended on the city of Samarkand, an ancient city in Central Asia that had been established as a capital of the Chagatai Khanate. The ruler that the Mongolians had imposed here some years earlier was killed, and Timur and Hussein established themselves as rulers over Samarkand and a substantial portion of the former Khanate. The conquest of Samarkand created a problem for Timur and Hussein. Previously, they were allies who had pooled their resources to acquire positions of power and wealth in Central Asia as the Chagatai Khanate collapsed. Now, a rivalry began to develop over who actually was in charge in Samarkand. Their growing antagonism towards one another eventually spilled over into open war. This was further complicated by the fact that in 1368, the Mongol Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan had established in China a century earlier was overthrown by the Ming dynasty, sundering the landscape of Mongolian rule across Asia further again. This would destabilize the eastern frontiers of the former Chagatai Khanate lands even more, and would also have implications at the very end of Timur's long life and reign. By 1368, the conflict between Timur and Hussein in Central Asia had become one for control over a large part of Transoxiana. Timur emerged victorious from it in 1370 when he defeated and captured his former ally at his old base at Balkh. Timur ordered his execution and then declared himself as the new governor rather than ruler of the Chagatai Khanate and lord of the Fortunate Conjunction, an astrological title imbued with significance in Central Asia which Mongol rulers had borne here for some time. Despite claiming to simply be a governor of the Chagatai Khanate, historians view these events in 1370 as marking the beginning of a new power in Central Asia, the Timurid Empire, or Empire of Timur. He would rule over an ever-growing confederacy from Samarkand over the next 35 years. Timur was very anxious to legitimize his rule after he secured firm control over the lands around Uzbekistan, northern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and eastern Turkmenistan in 1370. For any would-be Turkic-Mongol ruler in this region in the 14th century, the easiest way to do so was to establish that he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, and thus a legitimate successor to a part of his empire. At first, Timur took the unusual step of establishing a recognized descendant of Genghis, Sayur-Khatmish, as the actual Chagatai Khan, affirming himself to simply be the chief general and administrator of the Khanate. This was just a temporary expedient. At the same time, he married the widow of his former rival Hussein, a woman named Sareh Mulk Hanum, who was also descended from Genghis. Through this marriage, he claimed the title of Temur Gurgan, one which had been held by Genghis's sons-in-law back in the early 13th century. There were also fanciful efforts made in the years that followed to argue that Timur was directly descended himself from Genghis. Through these means, he established the notion over time that he was a descendant of the great Khan both by right of marriage and by blood. Sayur-Khatmish was eventually dispensed with, and Timur affirmed his position as emperor in his own right. On top of this, he was conscious of the need to declare his credentials as an Islamic ruler, something Genghis had never had to contend with. His position as a Turkic-Mongol leader in Central Asia precluded him from adopting any of the titles that the followers of the Prophet Muhammad had held amongst the Arab leaders of the Caliphate in the Middle East hundreds of years earlier. Instead, he proclaimed himself to be the Sword of Islam, a religious warlord as well as a Mongol leader. This title would become paradoxical over time. Timur was tolerant of Hindus, Jews, and Christians within his realms. Instead, the Sword of Islam was directed against fellow Muslims, specifically Shia Muslims, as Timur, at least nominally, proclaimed himself to be a Sunni Muslim, though the depth of his religious belief is questionable. For any ruler who establishes a new dynasty in the way which Timur did, securing the succession is almost as important as seizing power in the first place. Timur had no problems in this regard. Throughout his reign, the number of possible successors grew and grew in line with his list of wives. Polygamy was standard among Mongol rulers. In Timur's case, he had married for the first time when he was still in his teens, and his eldest children, 2 sons named Jahangir and Omar Shaikh, were born between 1355 and 1357. As we have seen, he married the sister of his erstwhile ally Hussein at the start of the 1360s, and then his widow a decade later. After he rose to power, he began accumulating wives at a steady rate. Some of them are mentioned briefly in the chronicles, and then disappear from the record again just as quickly. Most were the daughters of local rulers of regions that Timur conquered, the marriages being for the purposes of cementing political alliances and Timurid rule. An account by a European traveller to Samarkand in 1404 relates that Timur had 8 wives at that time, though some died over the years, and it seems fairly safe to assume that Timur had at least a dozen wives over the course of his lifetime. Amongst these, Sarai Mulk Khanum, Hussein's widow, was his chief wife, the recognized great queen of the empire. There were clear motives for her promotion, as Sarai was a descendant of Genghis Khan and a princess of Mogulistan, the name for the region where Transoxiana and Mongolia proper meet in the plains immediately north of the Himalayas. These unions resulted in dozens of children. Moreover, because he had children quite young, and they in turn started their own large families, by the latter stages of his reign, large parts of Timur's empire were ruled over by his sprawling cohort of sons and grandsons. It is no surprise that this situation would lead to a succession dispute when Timur died. While Timur was consolidating his rule in Samarkand, the political and military environment to the west was shifting. North of the Caspian Sea, the Golden Horde had been the dominant power all the way from the Black Sea to the Ural Mountains and south towards the Chagatai Khanate for a century. Like the Chagatai Khanate, this confederacy of Mongol groups was declining in the 14th century through internal power disputes, and because the Russian principalities up the river Volga towards the cities of Novgorod and Muscovy were strengthening. In 1380, Grand Prince Dmitry of the Duchy of Muscovy inflicted a major defeat on the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo. Further west, the Poles and other Christian states were also beginning to reassert themselves against the Mongols on their borders. To the south, the Ilkhanate that had ruled as a Mongol state over the northern end of the Middle East, the South Caucasus and into Persia, had collapsed quite quickly in the middle of the 14th century. Various new powers had risen to take its place, notably the White Sheep Turkmen, or Ak Koyunlu, in Persia, and much of what is now Iraq, and the Black Sheep Turkmen, or Kara Koyunlu, in eastern Turkey and the South Caucasus. Further west again, the first stirrings of what would become the Ottoman Empire were occurring in western Turkey, while a new dynasty, the Burji, claimed power in the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and the Levant. All of these powers were fighting one another, while there were further difficulties in these regions being wrought by the spread of the bubonic plague. Generally speaking, the world to the west of Timurid's emerging empire was filled with unstable powers that were at war with one another, a situation which held out the possibility of an outsider moving in to conquer the region if he brought the right army to bear in doing so. As early as 1372, when his rule over Samarkand and much of what had been the Chagatai Khanate was barely just in place, Timur set off west with his forces to begin expanding at the expense of these unstable powers of Western Asia. His first target was the Sufi dynasty, that ruled over the kingdom of Khwarezm or Khwarezmia, which lies south of the remnants of the Aral Sea around the modern border between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. He spent 2 years campaigning here to absorb the region into his fast-expanding realm. It was an important region through which the Amu Darya or Oxus River flows, a vital source of irrigation and farmland in an otherwise arid part of Central Asia. He then intervened in the ongoing strife within the White Horde, a component part of the Golden Horde, to ensure the accession of an ally named Tokhtamesh as head thereof. With a friendly ruler now on his northern border, Timur was free to turn his attention southwards, and he spent the remainder of the 1370s and into the 1380s focusing on reducing the great cities of eastern Persia and western Afghanistan to his rule. By 1382, his emergence as the preeminent conqueror of Central Asia was becoming clear after his armies campaigned as far west as the Caspian Sea. His reputation for fearsome conduct and psychological warfare, like Genghis Khan had done a century and a half earlier, was also established during this period. When a rebellion broke out in Khorasan in the early 1380s, he punished the inhabitants of the town of Isfizar by taking 2,000 inhabitants prisoner and then ordering them to be cemented together alive in a giant tower of clay, brick, and human. Those who survived the grisly work presumably were left to starve to death, stuck within the makeshift masonry. His methods were brutal and effective. The city of Kandahar in Afghanistan fell to the Timurid host in 1384, completing the conquest of most of Afghanistan and Persia. No sooner was Kandahar in his possession than Timur began developing a more ambitious strategy to the west. In 1385, he set off on a campaign to the Middle East, passing beyond the southern end of the Caspian Sea for the first time. The size of the armies he employed in these campaigns was very large, though there are no accurate records with which to come up with precise numbers. It is usually assumed that Timur had over 100,000 men under his command at a given time in the 1380s and 1390s, and often much more. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, for instance, he may have commanded as many as 140,000 men. Additionally, armies of this kind travelled with a huge amount of auxiliary staff and camp followers to keep them fed and found. Everything from people to provide huge amounts of fodder to keep the horses fed, to a considerable brigade of blacksmiths to mend weapons and other tools of war, followed in the train of Timur's host. This was the great army that he led into western Persia and Mesopotamia in 1386. He then turned north and rampaged through the Caucasus, seizing the city of Tbilisi in Georgia briefly, and even passing into Anatolia in what is now Turkey. The first campaign into the Middle East and the Caucasus would have ended in more substantial conquests had Timur not received word that his former ally Tokhtamesh had taken advantage of his absence far to the west to rampage into Central Asia, threatening Timur's core territories. Timur had no option but to set off back eastwards to counter the threat. It would not be his last visit to the Middle East, though, and when he returned, he would do so in ways which left a lasting memory. The threat that Tokhtamesh and the invasion of the Timurid Empire by the armies of the Golden Horde posed was far from a negligible one. Timur's former ally had invaded Central Asia with a huge army which, if some of the chronicles are to be believed, numbered anywhere up to 250,000 men. This was clearly an exaggeration designed by writers who wanted to praise Timur's achievement in seeing off this threat. For several years, the two armies shadowed each other around Central Asia until eventually Timur took the war to Tokhtamesh, invading Russia north of the Caspian and east of the Ural Mountains. The two enormous contingents met at the Battle of the Kondurcha River in what today is the Samara Oblast on the 18th of June 1391, after a 5-month march northwards by Timur. Despite being outnumbered, Timur's better trained men, many of whom already had access to basic firearms that were only just becoming available in Europe, held the line better against the Golden Horde's efforts to outflank them. In the end, Tokhtamish's ranks broke and fled. The Golden Horde was not defeated as a threat entirely in the long run. However, this was enough to end the immediate war, and with it, Timur was able to return to his long-held goal, to conquer the rich cities of the Middle East, above all, Baghdad, the capital of the old Arab Caliphate and the political center of the Muslim world. In 1392, Timur embarked on the 5-year campaign. It would be his most consequential of all his military campaigns. While many people are aware that Timur built an enormous empire in Central Asia and made incursions into the Middle East, the exact scale of his conquests and his odyssey into foreign lands is often underappreciated. The peak of this came during the 5-year campaign. By 1393, he had advanced well into the Middle East after forcing any recalcitrant elements within Persia to resubmit to him. He achieved one of his major aims quite easily that year, when Baghdad submitted to him without resistance after the ruler of the city, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, fled in advance of his army arriving. Another expedition was launched into Georgia in the same year, one which continued through 1394, culminating the following year at the Battle of the Terek River in the North Caucasus between Timur and the Golden Horde forces of Tohtamish. Victory for Timur once again ensured that Tohtamish abandoned any efforts to wage war on the Central Asian Empire and no longer troubled Timur for the rest of his reign. To reinforce the message that he had comprehensively defeated the Golden Horde, Timur continued on north and rampaged into southwestern Russia, sacking several cities and towns as a warning to his rival. With this done, Timur returned back through the Caucasus to the Middle East, pacifying some of the more resistant elements amongst the Ak-Koyunlu and Kara-Koyunlu. Then he made for home, having campaigned as far as any other Central Asian power had into Europe and the Middle East in the 14th century. Cities and towns across these regions acknowledged Timur as their ruler, and his empire now stretched from Baghdad and other parts of the Middle East to the Himalayas. After the 5-year campaign came to an end, and Timur returned home late in 1396, he spent nearly 2 years in Samarkand, the longest spell he would spend in the city uninterrupted, a sign of how unrelenting his military campaigning was, even as he entered his 60s. These 2 years of respite from war provided an opportunity for him to oversee a program of cultural, artistic, construction and religious work, which have cumulatively been considered to constitute the beginning of the Timurid Renaissance. There were many layers to this. A building program was undertaken at Samarkand to begin erecting a number of monumental mosques and buildings. Schools were opened to promote the study of mathematics, philosophy, and other subjects which the scholars of Persia and Baghdad had been the greatest proponents of in the Middle Ages. Classic art forms associated with Central Asia and China flourished, notably geometric art, rich rug and tapestry weaving, the carving of jade statues, and fine metalwork in gold and silver. The complex and colorful geometric tiling that adorns large civic and religious buildings in Samarkand, Bukhara and Tashkent to this very day, and which are some of the foremost attractions of those cities, often date to the Timurid era. Not all of this was achieved in Timur's time, but the schools and the court which he patronized laid the basis for formidable scholarship, even producing one future sultan, Ulugh Beg, who carried out important work as a mathematician and astronomer. He would build the Ulugh Beg Observatory in Samarkand, a kind of chess known as Tamerlane chess and derived from a Persian game called Shatranj, evolved here too. The Timurid Renaissance was one of the great cultural revivals anywhere in the world in the 14th and 15th centuries and would have a lasting legacy in Central Asia. A particular element of this Renaissance, which is worth examining in detail, is the architectural achievement of Timur's building program. Many monumental buildings were erected in Samarkand and the other cities of Central Asia during his reign. These had distinct elements, typically being adorned by colourful green and turquoise tiles on domes and doorways or towers, while geometric art of the kind typical of the Islamic world for religious reasons was elaborately produced around the walls. The most striking example is undoubtedly the Gur-er-Amir Mosque in Samarkand. It was commissioned by Timur late in his reign and appears to have been built with immense speed for such an edifice. The dome stands 30 meters high. Perhaps the most impressive element, though, is the outer shell. The geometric art on these buildings was not achieved simply by painting directly onto the walls. Instead, it was the product of carefully arranging tens of thousands of small, individually colored tiles in such a way as to make up mosaics of subtle yet refined color all around the building. Nor did Timur restrict his building program to Samarkand. A notable example of Timurid architecture is the mausoleum of Khawaja Ahmed Yazawi, a Sufi mystic and poet of the 12th century who had been laid to rest in the city of Turkestan in what is now southern Kazakhstan. The building Timur commissioned was left slightly unfinished, but it still stands in Turkestan to attest to the grandeur of Timurid monumental building, with its huge dome covered in vibrant green glazed tiles and geometric art all around the exterior. In his native Kesh, Timur ordered the building of a major palace complex, the Aksaray Palace. Built over a quarter of a century from 1380 onwards, it was partially destroyed in the 16th century. The remains, though, still point to its size and significance. It is here that the giant statue of Timur stands to commemorate his birthplace in Uzbekistan today. This work was continued by Timur's successors and members of the wider dynasty. Ulugh Beg, his grandson, who ruled the empire for a few years at the end of the 1440s, merits a special mention here. For instance, it was he who laid out the Registan, or Great Plaza in the center of Samarkand, around which he and several others built Islamic schools, known as madrasas. These were built in a distinct Persian architectural style and keenly attest to the way the Timurid Empire united Mongol, Turkic, Persian, and Arab cultural forms here in Central Asia as a result of the conquests of Timur. Moreover, these were often expansions of projects begun by the founder of the empire. Timur had ordered the laying out of gardens near where Ulugh Beg would later develop the Registan. Another great success of Timurid culture in the long run, in ways which Timur laid the ground for, was in the flourishing of Persian-style poetry and art at the Timurid court in the 15th century. There are many fine miniature paintings adorning books produced by scholars at Samarkand and other cities of the empire in the 15th century. Interestingly, while these are Persian at heart, they bear slight traces of Mongol and even Chinese culture, notably in the inclusion of dragon motifs or pictures of individuals with distinctly Turkic or Mongol features. Decades after Timur's death, the multicultural empire he had built through an endless succession of wars was still finding expression in the works being produced by scholars and artists at Samarkand and beyond. The conspicuous wealth that allowed for such art, architecture, and scholarship to flourish contrasts sharply with notions that Central Asia was a relatively poor place in medieval times. Furthermore, given the sheer devastation that was wrought by Timur's wars and the instability that had prevailed in Transoxiana for decades before Timur emerged as a ruler there, we could be forgiven for thinking that this was not a wealthy part of the world. And yet, this is not true. The Silk Roads, the system of trade routes which connected the Far East all the way to Western Europe, were at their peak in the High Middle Ages and the late medieval era. The name of these is derived from the fact that silk produced in China was one of the main commodities transported thousands of kilometers overland, north of the Himalayas, through Central Asia, and then south of the Caspian Sea to the Levant and the Mediterranean, where Italian merchants conveyed it to Europe from ports in Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Spices, jade, and much else of value came on the Silk Roads too, as did new technologies like gunpowder and improved types of paper. It was generally one-way traffic. Europe had little to offer China or India other than gold and silver, and much that it wanted. Cities like Samarkand, Tashkent, and Bukhara had grown rich for centuries on the back of this trade. Their importance is demonstrated in European maps like the Catalan Atlas of 1375, where a mapmaker in Spain noted these faraway cities. It's doubtful many Europeans would have known of them had they not been so integral to the trade of the Silk Roads. Indeed, despite the view of Genghis and Timur as violent figures who visited immense amounts of war and death on Asia, they also facilitated trade and cultural exchange across the Silk Roads that traversed Eurasia. A person traveling from Western Mongolia to the Middle East at the end of Timur's reign could do so without ever leaving the lands of the Timurid Empire, something which certainly made it easier to trade along such vast distances. As this occurred, Samarkand and many other cities in Central Asia grew wealthier in Timur's reign and continued to do so through the 15th century after his time. Timur eventually returned to the saddle and commenced another military campaign in 1398. The year before, he had sent his eldest grandson, Pir Muhammad, south towards the Indus River Valley to reconnoitre the area. The following year, Timur headed south himself and led an army into the Hindu Kush, and then onwards to the city of Delhi. Late that year, he sacked the city, reputedly unleashing carnage there that saw the city plundered, the population massacred, and its riches carried away. Delhi would take a century to recover from the devastations Timur's armies unleashed on it in the space of a few days. Then he began his third and last campaign into the Middle East in 1399. Along the way, he took the opportunity to reimpose his rule directly over the cities of Persia. The Timurid Empire was not a centralized state with a large and efficient government bureaucracy. Timur was reliant on local placemen to rule distant provinces on his behalf, and power was exercised as much by showing up periodically with an army and reaffirming that terrible things would happen if orders weren't obeyed, as it was on any form of functional government. This done, he continued on to the Middle East. His campaign through Mesopotamia and the Levant in 1400 and 1401 was arguably the most violent yet. It focused primarily on twin sieges of the great cities of Damascus and Baghdad, the first in the winter of 1400 and into the early spring, the second directly afterwards in the summer of 1401. When all was said and done, Timur had extended his rule comprehensively over the region and was now in command of an empire that stretched westwards to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in Syria. If the chronicles and other accounts of this third Middle Eastern campaign are to be believed, Timur's armies engaged in an almost senseless degree of violence between 1399 and 1402. Everywhere they went, thousands of prisoners were taken captive in cities and towns. Then they were generally killed in gruesome ways. When he captured the city of Sivas in 1400, Timur is reputed to have ordered that 3,000 prisoners should be buried alive there. This paled in comparison with what happened after they took the road to Damascus. After the city was captured at the end of a 3-month-long siege, Timur's armies mass murdered the population, leaving behind vast piles of thousands of corpses in their wake and enslaving much of the rest. This was the reason why one of those slaves, Arab Shah, who wrote a critical account of Timur's reign years later, remarked that Damascus had still not recovered from the Timurid carnage when he returned to his home city 20 years later. At Baghdad, a few months after the brutality at Damascus, Timur's hordes were said to have built 120 towers, made of the decapitated heads of 90,000 people after they sacked the city. Nor was this just in the Middle East, where Timur could have argued that he was deploying exemplary punishment against rebels who had broken away from his rule after first conquering the region in the mid-1390s. No such argument could be deployed in the case of Delhi, where a similar massacre occurred. Utterly pointless destruction accompanied this loss of human life. While a small army of builders were erecting great mosques in Samarkand, Timur's armies were destroying the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and other peerless buildings in Baghdad. Demographers and military historians have calculated that Timurid's endless wars probably resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 10 and 20 million people. Perhaps the figures provided for his actions in places like Baghdad, Delhi and Damascus were exaggerated. Yet even if we halve those figures, there was still an extraordinary amount of death visited on Central Asia and the Middle East by Timur. Timur became known in distant lands for the ruthless manner in which he dealt with those who had opposed him, something which had been characteristic of Mongol armies going back to the days of Genghis Khan, when their conquests were achieved as much through psychological warfare as battle itself. In part, this was simply because he was one of the few rulers of Central Asia in pre-modern times that established diplomatic contact with rulers around Europe. In the French National Archives today, there is a letter written in Persian from Timur to King Charles VI of France in 1402. European rulers and governments of the time knew Timur and had heard of his rapid and violent conquests. This view of Timur as a particularly violent conqueror was so rife in the 15th and 16th centuries that it found its way onto the London stage. In 1587, Christopher Marlowe's play, Tamerlane the Great, was staged for the first time in the English capital. Much of the action centres on the siege of Damascus in the winter of 1400. Marlowe had Timur's armies employing a system of white, red and black tents that are erected outside the city on successive days. The white tent on the first day indicates that the inhabitants will be spared if they surrender. The second day, red tents are pitched to signal that now all men of fighting age will be killed if the city falls. On the third day, black tents appear to indicate that Timur's armies will spare nobody within. Marlowe's play was very successful and would shape European views of Timur for centuries to come. As a result, the emperor appeared in many subsequent European cultural works. Two of the greatest Baroque composers, George Frederick Handel and Antonio Vivaldi, composed operas in which Timur is a central character. In America, Edgar Allan Poe published a collection of poetry in 1827 called Tamerlane and Other Poems. Timur's conquest of Damascus opened up the possibility of a move towards the Mediterranean Sea, a region where even the Mongols back in the days of Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons over a century earlier had only been able to establish a transient presence. Timur certainly flirted with the idea of conquering further west to Anatolia in western Turkey or southwest into Egypt. But after a last major strike in central Turkey, where he clashed with the Ottomans near modern-day Ankara, he finally turned around and headed back towards Samarkand. Word was sent out as he retired to the capital that a great Kurultai was to be convened in the plains near Samarkand. This was a traditional gathering that had a place in both Turkic and Mongol culture, whereby lords and other figures within a tribe or confederacy would convene together to discuss political and military matters. The Kurultai that Timur assembled, and which finally met in the Kanikil meadows near Samarkand in the autumn of 1404, lasted a full 2 months and was one of the most lavish gatherings that Central Asia had ever seen. It was as much a celebratory acknowledgement of Timur's conquests as a council of leaders deliberating on affairs. Contemporary accounts indicate that, all Muslim prescriptions on alcohol aside, this was a wine-soaked affair with feasts and festivities almost every day. Thousands of local leaders assembled in giant tents in a throwback to the days of Genghis Khan. These were combined with the celebration of the wedding of one of Timur's grandsons. So lavish was this that thousands of merchants and other tradespeople of Samarkand made their way out of the city to temporarily set up their stores at the site of the Kurultai. Samarkand's position at the heart of a great empire drew enormous wealth to the city, in spite of the many wars and the bloodshed and destruction that Timur's wars created across the Middle East and Central Asia. We have a particularly illuminating account of his court and the city of Samarkand right at the end of Timur's reign, which notes the splendor of the capital. This came from the pen of Ruy González de Clavijo, a nobleman of the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. In 1403, he was dispatched by the King of Castile, Henry III, to the court of the great new emperor, whom even the ruler of a kingdom as far away as Castile in Spain had heard of. He would write an extensive travel diary of his journey and his impressions of the lands he passed through. Clavijo's embassy aimed to establish contact with Timur and possibly negotiate trade and military alliances with him. This was an era in which the Castilians and other Europeans were looking to find allies that might offset the danger posed by the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean and the possibility of this new Turkish power conquering Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. When Clavijo arrived to Samarkand in 1404, he was struck by the magnificence of the city, stating that, quote, "The richness and abundance of this great capital and its district is such as is indeed a wonder to behold." He was particularly struck by the way the huge suburbs of fine houses were interspersed with orchards of melons and other fruit. There seemed to be building going on everywhere, and Timur's penchant for perfectionism was noted when it came to erecting mosques and other public buildings. Clavijo was also struck by the abundance of silk everywhere. He calculated that the city probably had a population of 150,000 people, which would have made it about twice the size of London at the time. Clavijo was delighted to learn at Samarkand that Sultan Bayezid I of the fledgling Ottoman Empire had been captured by the Timurids at the Battle of Ankara shortly before he had set off with his embassy from Spain. He had died in captivity in 1403, triggering a succession crisis amongst the Ottomans that provided a brief respite for the Byzantines and the other Christian powers in the Balkans, although Constantinople would fall eventually anyway in 1453. Besides this, Clavijo's embassy was ultimately a failure. He and his companions got to see Samarkand and were clearly well hosted by the Timurids. However, the official diplomatic meetings which the Spaniard wished to have with Timur never occurred. After successive delays, he decided to leave the court and return to Europe late in 1404. What he did not know when he left was that Timur had been unable to grant him an audience as he was preparing for a new campaign. This time he intended to head eastwards to wage war on the might of China and overthrow the Ming dynasty that had usurped the Mongol Yuan dynasty there back in 1368. There were also reports that Timur had been sick during Clavijo's time in Samarkand, and these were evidently true. His campaign against the Chinese never materialized. Not long after setting off, he fell ill near Otrar, in what is now Kazakhstan, and died on the 18th of February 1405, after becoming bedridden with a severe fever. Though he had stated his wish that his remains would be laid to rest in his native Kesh, Timur's body was placed in an ebony coffin and taken back to Samarkand, where he was interred in the Gur-e-Amir mosque that he had ordered the construction of not long before. Over a period of 4 decades, Timur had built an absolutely enormous empire across Central Asia and into the Middle East, the largest Mongol state seen since the empire of Genghis Khan had been divided up over 100 years earlier. However, it had been built on the back of the formidable abilities of this conqueror and ruler, and was held together in part because of the fearsome reputation he had propagated to the world. The problem with building an empire in this way is that it is prone to quickly contracting or even collapsing once the ruler that held it together dies or otherwise departs from the scene. This is what happened in the case of the Timurid Empire to a certain extent. It did not collapse, but it did contract very considerably in the 20 years or so after Timur's time. The succession started this process. It was disputed between several of his sons and grandsons, Khalil, Pir Mohammed, and Shahrukh Mirza. Civil war followed until Shahrukh claimed control over Samarkand from Khalil in 1409 and united the empire under his sole rule. Although this civil war was a short one, it was sufficiently disruptive that rebellions began breaking out against Timurid rule, particularly so in the very remote parts of the empire in the Caucasus and the Middle East. Karakoyunlu was revived, and Akkoyunlu claimed control over much of the Middle Eastern territories again. Shahrukh spent much of his long reign down to 1447 waging war against these powers in an unsuccessful attempt to reclaim them. A rapid turnover of rulers in the late 1440s and early 1450s saw the empire fragment. Several competent rulers emerged in the second half of the 15th century, yet constant civil wars saw the Timurid Empire shrink by the 1480s to an area approximating to just modern-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, northern Afghanistan, eastern Iran, and part of Turkmenistan. Out of the seeming ruins of Timur's empire, another great one began to emerge a century after his death, in much the same way that Timur himself had constructed a mighty Central Asian empire out of the remnants of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. In the mid-1490s, his great-great-great-grandson Zahir-ud-Din succeeded as emir of the city of Fergana. Though he was only a child at the time, he set out on a campaign of conquests in the late 1490s and early 1500s, which established him as a powerful lord over part of the Timurid territory. He then used his base to conquer Afghanistan from his rivals, and this then became the basis for him to follow in his great-great-great-grandfather's footsteps and campaign south into India. Today, this descendant of Timur is known by the nickname he adopted for himself, Babur, meaning tiger. Over the first quarter of the 16th century, Babur and his Turkic-Mongol armies conquered much of Pakistan and northwestern India, culminating in 1526 in the capture of the city of Delhi. With this, Timurid power was transferred south to rule over Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Persian and then European observers came to know this great Indian state as the Mogul or Mughal Empire, a derivation of Mongol in recognition that the rulers of this empire were descended via Timur from the Mongols of Genghis Khan's time. The Mughal Empire would rule over northern India and Pakistan for 300 years and would only be gradually reduced and then entirely conquered by the English East India Company. In the Taj Mahal and other magnificent buildings erected by the Mughal rulers in India can be seen elements of the Timurid architectural style developed in Samarkand and Bukhara in the late 14th century. Hence, while Timur's empire quickly contracted after his own death in the 15th century, its impact on the history of Asia was still being felt hundreds of years later in India. There was one final twist in the tale of Timur's life that has added a further air of mystery to his story and the violence of it. In the time following his death, a legend developed that Timur's tomb in Samarkand was cursed and that anyone who disturbed his resting place would bring destruction upon themselves. It is believed that an early realization of this curse came in 1740. That year, Nader Shah Afshar, ruler of the new Persian Empire, conquered the city of Samarkand. Legend has it that he visited Timur's tomb and took a jade slab from it as a memento. Not long after, back in Persia, the Shah's son became ill. Nader Shah's advisors counseled him to return the jade stone to the tomb of Timur, which he did. His son's health then miraculously improved. While this story seems a bit fantastical, there is a concrete factual basis for events almost exactly 2 centuries later. In the summer of 1941, a Russian historian and anthropologist, Mikhail Gerasimov, led a Soviet expedition to Samarkand to investigate Timur's tomb. When they arrived, 3 elderly locals approached them to warn them against opening the sarcophagus containing Timur's remains. They went ahead anyway, and lore has it that an inscription was found on the inside declaring that a great vengeance would be brought on those who disturbed Timur's rest. A few days later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. It is estimated that around 25 to 27 million Soviet soldiers and citizens would lose their lives over the next 4 years. So concerned was the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin about the implications of opening Timur's tomb that he ordered that a formal Islamic reburial should be carried out in November 1942. Right around this time, the Soviets turned the tide in the Second World War by launching Operation Uranus that led to the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at the Battle of Stalingrad. Given the coincidental timing of all of this, it's no surprise that the alleged curse of Timur's tomb has generated a lot of interest over the years. Timur, the founder of the Timurid Empire, was a ruler of contrasts. He rose from relative obscurity in what is now Uzbekistan to begin carving out his own kingdom in the 1360s. He managed to establish a large state in Central Asia out of the collapsing Chagatai Khanate. After consolidating his rule here by claiming descent through marriage from Genghis Khan, he then embarked on an ever more ambitious set of military campaigns. These saw him capture the city of Baghdad, the capital of the once proud Arab Caliphate, twice, while also foraying into the Caucasus. He even campaigned into India as well, in between his Middle Eastern conquests. By the time he was done, he had created an empire that stretched from Syria to the Himalayas, and from Russia around the Ural Mountains south to the Indus River. Yet the conquests came at a terrible price. Ancient and noble cities like Delhi and Damascus were devastated by his armies, and his campaigns are understood to have led to the deaths of millions of people, though the precise figure can only be guessed at. And then there was a completely different side to Timur. When not at war, he oversaw the construction of a great city at Samarkand, one where artists, scholars and religious figures were given patronage and immense buildings like the Gur-e-Amir Mosque were erected. The empire he left behind would also have a long shelf life after his descendant Babur established the Mughal Empire in India, a state that would preserve the legacy of the Timurid Empire down to the 19th century. In short, he was a complex ruler, like Genghis Khan before him, a hugely violent figure who was not without cultural achievements. What do you think of Emperor Timur? Was he the brutal, murderous warlord that he has so often been depicted as, or was he a much more complex and sophisticated ruler than this? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.